So just to welcome back and just to remind the viewers and listeners of where we are, this is the end of module 3 and actually then the precedent to where the fun starts because the next module and any subsequent modules, although at this point, stage in September 2022, only 4 modules are planned and there may be future ones. Um, Maybe that's a spoiler alert. I don't know. To be continued. But so now we are actually reaching the end of the rainbow, so to speak, of this theoretical journey. And oops, having some troubles here. And at this point, actually, I'm interested in reviewing the last 2 cooperative principles as tools for cybernetic feedback or for to interpret these as such. And so I would like to draw a point on the way in which actually cooperative principles can serve as a tool to promote ascendancy. Of course, now we've discussed notions of macroculture, we've discussed notions of ascendancy, and I intend to connect these 2 ideas. So I believe that and I'm convinced that the cooperative principles, as I've described, and as those that I will interpret in a moment, can do so by acting to promote certain macro cultures and distinguish themselves particularly in the latter stage of ascendancy. And as I said, of course, reviewing this notion of process ecology in the last 2 videos, in particular the last video, there is a distinction between the size of a system and its organization vis-a-vis its potential to be reorganized in other ways. And again, the notion that Ulanovich has adopted is that at a latter stage of growth and development of a system, rather the development of the system or its internal coherency is what matters. Whereas in the earlier stages of the growth or development of a complex system, is described by a focus or a size bias. So systems usually grow before they turn towards internal cohesion. And this is what Radonovich means by ascendancy, which is a term that is designed to capture both of these 2 notions, both growth and development, or what he calls development, which might be internal organization in another terminology, to distinguish it from the idea of development economics. And in this sense, in the latter stage of ascendancy, development of a qualitatively mutualistic economic substructure can in fact be enabled by these cooperative principles, which is to say that as the developmental components of the economy take precedence over the growth components, of course, as the Club of Rome has been telling us for many decades and has just released a new report on the Earth for everyone, a cooperative logic seems to be in the best position to serve as a motor of reorienting or for reorienting the economy away from detrimental and towards beneficial linkages and associations. So again, it's a focus on the interactions between nodes in a system, both the individuals and as well as organizations within the economy. And part of this reasoning is due to the dualistic nature of complex systems. The last of the 3 corollary shifts that I introduced at the end of the last video suggested the heuristic never push single goals too far because doing so invariably leads to system catastrophe. And in many ways, the era of growth-fueled advancement of human economies has outlived its greater social and environmental use, as many of the decroissance, steady-state, degrowth, ecological economics, and many other paradigms are suggesting and have been telling us, as the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, has been telling us also for many years. Therefore, a shift towards more effective organization along the lines of democratic choice mechanisms and elective or inalienable hierarchies, taking into account the trade-offs of singular focus, what Philip de Boot has called the one thought, focusing on profit or shareholder value, appears to be a promising solution. And I suggest that the notions like those that I've outlined in prior videos can actually help in this regard. Before getting further, I wanted to return again to the three, or rather the two remaining cooperative principles, Principle 6 and Principle 7. So now getting back into this modeling activity, the first principle that I would like to now turn to is Principle 6. So we left it off here. Now we're finally getting back. The sixth principle, of course, is cooperation amongst cooperatives. It states that cooperatives serve their members most effectively and strengthen the cooperative movement by working together through local, national, regional, and international structures. It represents a realization that cooperatives must explicitly nurture and support one another, as the notes suggest, and was adapted at the Vienna Congress in 1966 as a clarification of the cooperative principles. The 1966 report stated that we have thought it important to add a principle of growth by mutual cooperation among cooperatives. Moreover, the report states, although the principles originated as rules governing the relations of the individual members of cooperatives with one another and with their societies, their application is not confined to primary societies. They should be loyally observed by institutions which represent the cooperation of cooperative societies rather than of individual persons. So this is thinking of what are called second order or second tier cooperatives. These are federations of cooperatives. And in Germany, for instance, we have here the DZ Bank, which is a bank of cooperative banks. Would be intended by this statement here. The idea, the notes continue, of a cooperative sector in the economy is too often an intellectual concept without a corresponding material reality, simply because of the lack of unity and cohesion between the different branches of the movement. If the cooperative movement is to rise to its full stature, either within each country or internationally, cooperative institutions must unreservedly support one another. So this was stated again in 1966. The notes describe it as a practical expression of the cooperative's value of solidarity and shows two dimensions of the nature of cooperatives. So to just specify which two dimensions these are, the first is the economic and the second is the social logic. Therefore, in joining a cooperative, members are not only helping to build their own cooperatives, but the wider cooperative movement to create wealth for the many, not personal wealth for the few. Moreover, in a statement reminiscent of the discussion of Pfeffer's notion of interorganizational interdependence and his resource dependency theory, the notes state that the normative approach, subject to compliance with anti-competition and antitrust legislation, is for cooperatives to cooperate with each other in competitive markets through forming of cooperative groups, secondary cooperatives, and federations to realize the cooperative advantage and create commonwealth for mutual benefit. So this reference to antitrust and anti-competition legislation is not just an arbitrary reference. In fact, there has been some problems with cooperatives clashing with these antitrust legislations, such as in Italy, there was a case brought against an Italian law in 2001 that ultimately actually led to the rescinding of this law, I think in 2006. And it goes to show that much of the antitrust law is actually geared towards a very different set of stakeholders, namely for profit-driven enterprises that follow the single thought of shareholder value. And oftentimes this leads to cooperatives being caught in a type of a double bind. And this actually requires or should require governments to work much more closely with cooperative stakeholders in order to achieve a more level playing field. Nevertheless, the notes state that this sixth principle is about working together continuously to the same end, not simply about the occasional collaboration. Collaboration through similar, though similar to collaboration, though similar to cooperation, works for a single defined objective, whereas cooperation is a more intense commitment and longer term engagement to achieve shared goals. So the notes. There's also some emphasis on emergence as a phenomenon in the sixth principle. This is why I've reserved this for this late stage, because I'm discussing ecological complexity issues here. The notes state that while individual cooperatives can succeed alone, they will only thrive and grow the cooperative commonwealth when they work together. A factual limit to creating such a cooperative commonwealth is the behaviors and attitudes the fourth principle, which is autonomy, instills. The notes recognize this, stating that it is perhaps because each cooperative can do so much by themselves that cooperatives fail to realize how much more they can do together. The sixth principle is central in the process of synthesizing the autonomy the fourth principle underlines, with the fact that through higher order cooperation, cooperatives can be greater than the sum of their parts. So in fact, one actually can see a tension between the fourth and sixth principle, because cooperation amongst cooperatives seems to stand against the formal autonomy. But again, the question is, when are there opportunities to rise above such double binds? As Gregory Bateson reminds us, when there are dilemmas between two values, one usually has to go to a level higher to see a solution that is amicable to all. So one could possibly embed autonomy within an interconnected sphere, or create negotiated coordination bodies that are responsible for attenuating these various conflicts that result from these values in clash. Important is to redress grievances and not to avoid them. Moving on very quickly to the seventh and last principle, concern for community. It states that cooperatives work for the sustainable development of their communities through policies approved by their members. It is the last principle to receive recognition and was only recognized at the 1995 Congress. The notes state that the seventh principle combines two elements of the cooperative values in the Alliance's statement on cooperative identity, those of self-help and self-responsibility, and at the same time, the ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. This ensemble principle, and talking again about notions like propensities, arises, argue the notes, because cooperatives emerge from and are rooted in the communities in which they conduct their business operations. Moreover, it serves as a reflection of the fact that the ethical values in the Alliance's statement on the cooperative identity emanate from the special relationships cooperatives have with their communities, which goes beyond simple business economics. In many ways, the seventh principle is the cooperative version of triple bottom line reasoning. The notes comment that the triple sustainable development logic of concern for economic, social, and environmental sustainability tends to reinforce each other, in that concern for social and environmental sustainability makes business sense and helps to sustain a cooperative's economic success. Its inclusion in 1995 coincided with multilateral dialogue at the time on so-called sustainable development, which connected the Smithian logic of wealth creation with logics of combating inequality and environmental degradation. That is, balancing needs and limits. Therefore, the text of the principle is to be read as an appeal to balance three aspects: ecological balance, social justice, and economic security. They are mutually interdependent and regenerative, hence must be pursued concomitantly, as the notes suggest. The text's focus on members' communities shows that the primary emphasis of concern is for the local communities within which a cooperative carries on its business operations. Moreover, the text again leans on the second principle, emphasizing the democratic member control over such activities. The notes make clear that the wording and broader context of cooperative principles and values means it is this social dimension of sustainable development that the unique nature of cooperative enterprise has the power to deliver. The notes describe the response to the devastating 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka, coordinated by the Alliance, as an example of this ability. And I do go into this example extensively in I think it is actually chapter 10 of the cooperative economy, which actually would be part of module 4. So perhaps I will actually get into that in a future video. The purview of the seventh principle can be extended nearly indefinitely. International coordination of peace-promoting activities, good employment situations, support for youth, contributions to efforts to stem economic inequality in the wake of globalization, promotion of green consumerism and organic produce are all domains where cooperative principles, practice, and the needs of the greater community can be mutualistically pursued, revealing the versatility of the cooperative logic in relationalizing with other logics. Moreover, the notes make clear the synergies between these mutualistic goals and certain aspects of human nature, and underlines the reciprocal benefits in following such missions. So the notes state that the benefits from this responsible commitment to sustainability circle back through new members, increased turnover, and higher surpluses that reinforce a cooperative's economic success. The long-term sustainability of cooperatives requires a long-term commitment and positive, ongoing relationship with the communities in which they work. It is to the mutual advantage of communities and cooperatives alike. The concluding discussion here on these principles, I would actually like to look at these two principles and all of the principles as elements both of negotiated coordination and then in a moment as elements of propensities. So first of all, to get into the notion of negotiated coordination, particularly to recall Pat Devine's point about subsidiarity, he argues that production units at the local level, so these are factories or even lesser units like plants, are better equipped to estimate local demand for their stocks and are therefore in the best position to realize social value from their perspective. Thus, decisions in the longer term or at greater scales, of which Devine focuses mainly on the investment functions, frequently go beyond the purview of the resources or the resources of the individual production unit. And it is here that greater social and individual benefit can be gleaned by transferring some decision-making capacity to NCBs or negotiated coordination bodies. Comparing these notions with the discussion of secondary agricultural cooperatives as outlined by the UN body, the FAO, it is easy to see that the isomorphic qualities of the division of labor between small and large organizations in these assessments is valid. Negotiated coordination and similar paradigms are therefore useful framing devices for discussing, assessing, and communicating the benefits and costs of the cooperative principles in practice. It also represents an analytical shift away from ontological individualism and towards a dynamic worldview that considers emergent social properties in the first instance instead of as an afterthought, as in the case of neoclassical perspectives. Such a worldview recognizes that in many ways, as systems become more complex and scale up, the causal linkages between the higher levels become simpler, as a recent paper by Pavel Chekhov and Edgar Hull has suggested. This occurs on the one hand because interdependencies become looser and less acute, and also because coordination at higher levels is in itself a more complex undertaking, and elegance can be seen as a virtue at that scale. The cooperative principles can thus be interpreted as simple signals and heuristics along which higher order organizational change can occur. Recognizing the isomorphism between the cooperative principles and negotiated coordination may provide the impetus for consideration of the need for lower order and higher order principles for cooperation. Again, I have divided these principles into two groups accordingly. And these sixth and seventh principles would, in my categorization, fall under the higher order principles, whereas the first four would very clearly be in the first order, whereas or the lower order, whereas the fifth principle, education, training, and information, would sort of be a connecting lever between these two levels. Lastly, to look at the principles as propensities, it would appear, in the sense of Karl Popper, that the cooperative principles serve precisely as an ensemble of propensities, which facilitate, just to remind listeners and viewers, they facilitate non-random responses to environmental changes. Therefore, while investor-owned businesses may also react non-randomly to specific changes in their environment based on market conditions, market forces, and they're privy to the stakeholder or shareholder, rather, logic of shareholder maximization or profit maximization, the fact that they are only generally connected by the principle of profit maximization restricts the degree to which they may coordinate behavior and, in general, limits the predictability of their responses. Cooperative enterprise, on the other hand, actively constrains itself on a number of levels, which I have outlined in general and especially in a prior video in this module. The fact that cooperatives are democratically controlled by members means that ideally, and this of course is not always the case in practice, as we will see in the last module, module 4, means that a small cadre of elites generally cannot steer policies or should not be able to. The fact that members participate economically means that logics, besides maximizing return, steer investment and other decisions. The fact that they are autonomous means that policies like mergers and acquisitions are to be avoided if possible within the cooperative sector and do not become a routine. It is easy to see that these principles operate as an ensemble of constraints that channel behaviors and expectations for both members and the wider community with whom cooperatives interact. The next topic that I would introduce is the cooperative n-tuple helix. And in fact, this will be the very last slide and discussion in this module. So as part of a greater communicative turn, which Lud Leidesdorff attributes to the results of what he calls the scientific technical revolution, the nature of the logics driving production, consumption, and innovation have fundamentally changed. Leidesdorff suggests that Marx was aware of these shifts when the latter wrote that if technology could enable us to free man from work sufficiently, the nature of capitalism would change, since the basis of this mode of production would fall away. According to Leidesdorff, such a shift requires a more active focus on communicative acts, on information, and the dual role of individuals as both observers of existing codes and builders of new codes. Leidesdorff emphasizes that these two roles are distinct and require the application of different logics. As I have observed in prior videos, phenomena like the cooperative principles, and in fact in this video, act not only to constrain behavior, they also act as signals. This relates social norms like the cooperative principles to natural selection. However, there are some distinctions between biological evolution and the evolutionary dynamics driving processes like those the cooperative principles regulate. So there should be some skepticism in merely copying and pasting notions like natural selection to such very complex phenomena. In particular, biological selection, as Lud Leidesdorff argues, is based on genotypes that are hardwired, historically present, and thus observable, such as DNA. The quote-unquote genotypes of cultural evolution, such as in this case, the cooperative principles, are codes of communication which can further be developed because they are not hardwired, argues Leidesdorff. Therefore, flows of communication are molded by selective codes on the one hand and variation on the other. These contexts provide two analytically different perspectives on the same events. The data can be organized using different logics. From an historical perspective, one focuses on variation and agency and the potential morphogenesis of system relations in the data. From an evolutionary perspective, Leidesdorff argues, the focus is on the same data indicating selection environments, which can be specified on the basis of a reflexive turn. So again, in the first instance, applying this to the cooperative principles, one would analyze a cooperative and its members according to again, the differences that different cooperatives have, in particular amongst another, and with respect to other types of enterprise or firms, and certainly the way that these principles have evolved or have developed historically. And the other perspective, the evolutionary perspective, would look at, again, the particular the principles as they have changed with respect to changes in the environment. Uh, and this reflexive turn can be seen in overlays, as Leidesdorff suggests, between multiple logics. That means that both the cooperative principles themselves and the agency they facilitate, for instance, the shift from informal project-based collaborative arrangements to networks, and even cooperative federations that I have alluded to in prior principles, they can entail such an overlay. But and in effect, all this means is a bleeding over of different logics, such as the logic of profit maximization with that of community concern, and the logic of cooperation, and so on. So a triple bottom line might be such an example of an overlay. But even more interesting and significant is the potential for higher order overlays, where, for instance, the interactions between higher order organizations subscribing to cooperative principles and governments and academic institutions, um, following the arguments that Leidesdorff provides, the um, we may quantify the level of bleeding over of the logic of cooperation into other carrying cycles. This process of incursion, as Leidesdorff calls it, occurs via the effects of correlations among distributions of relations on expectations. So where I extend this discussion is to discuss the notion of a cooperative n-tuple helix. This scenario can be shown, I think, with respect to this notion. And in fact, I show a version of this n-tuple helix in the top picture on the right here. It is not totally in keeping with the format that Leidesdorff himself uses, which I can show you in a moment. And in fact, it is here. So when we have an n-tuple helix, there are different layovers here that we can see. And this is something that I was given to by Ivana. Let me think, forgetting her name. In any case, this is not central to the discussion, but the shape should look like this instead of a concentric ring. In any case, we see here the logics of regulation, cooperation, profit maximization, and cooperation at work. However, this representation is unsatisfying, as it still leaves out the important function of novelty production. While the cooperative logic does present itself a form of innovation, there are innovations that do not necessarily derive from a cooperative logic. In fact, as described throughout the past videos, cooperation and competition in the form of agony exist in an agonic relation to one another, and the present contribution, my lectures and this module, seeks merely to compensate for the lack of attention that cooperation has received in the economic literature. So just to describe an example of this, which can be found in I think it is the end of chapter 8 of the Cooperative Economy, can be found in the calculation of these figures for the Cooperative Development Fund of Italy's largest cooperative federation. And that fund is called Co-op Fund, and it actually receives funding from about 15,000 cooperatives who each provide 3% of their profits annually for investment and development in the cooperative sector. Co-op Fund itself engages in investments in education, training, and research, and has a maximum of 2 million euros annually available for such investments in education, training, and research. Using this 2 million euros as an indicator for the synergy between the cooperative, profit maximizing, and educational helices, we get a capacity of roughly 11.5 million, euros and an ascendancy of 10 million euros, which shows again that there actually, well, we leave around 1.5 million euros in a reserve. So again, this is the ascendancy and the entropy, or the overhead rather. Um, and again, in this situation, it means that with regard to this trilateral relation, co-op fund could increase resilience by either increasing system complexity, by increasing perhaps the funding rate from 3% to 5% of profits, or by diverting more of its existing capacity to such funding. And again, this is just to show the interrelation between the size of the system itself, the throughput, and the organization. These things both matter. They can be decoupled, but especially in later um, stages of systems, actually the development or the organization of a system is more significant. So in this case, this would be the relative value of the amount that co-op fund dedicates towards education, training, and research. So I hope this brief overview has been very helpful to surveying the scene, so to speak, of the cooperative economy towards a stakeholder-led democracy, at least as regards its theoretical components. In the next module, things will get a little bit more fun, as I will go into some of the empirical research that I've conducted in the course of my research. I do hope to see you there.